6 days after burying my husband, my son thought he had taken everything from me. My home, my business, my place in the family. He didn't realize I still had one powerful weapon left: silence. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. Instead, I drafted a letter simple and sharp, reminding him that the house he tried to steal, the inn he tried to claim, and the life he thought he erased were still mine. When his reply came full of excuses and blame, I didn't respond. I gathered every document, every proof, every right they tried to bury, until for the first time in my life, I felt the power shift back into my own hands. This isn't a story of loud revenge. It's a quiet reclaiming of everything they never deserved to hold. My name is Lillian Monroe, and if you had met me just a few years ago, you'd probably see me as the woman who always had a warm smile and freshly baked muffins waiting for every guest. For most of my life, I was known simply as Franklin's wife, the quiet force behind the little inn we built together. Seabreeze Haven Inn. I wasn't anyone remarkable by the world's standards. I didn't travel far. I didn't chase dreams of grandeur. My life was built on simple bricks, raising my son Carter, keeping the inn running, and standing by my husband Franklin through every storm that life threw at us. I was the woman who made sure every light bulb was changed before guests arrived. The woman who stayed up late folding linens while Franklin handled the books. The one who remembered birthdays, who showed up at every parent-teacher conference, who cooked meals for Carter, even when the bills were tight and the winters colder than they should have been. I didn't mind sacrificing. I told myself this was love, this was family, and it would all be worth it because we were building something together. But standing in that cemetery just 6 days after Franklin's heart gave out, I started to realize that maybe, just maybe, all that sacrifice didn't count for much in the end. I stood there, dressed in black, a simple wool coat wrapped around me, my hands fidgeting with the hem of my gloves because it gave me something to do, something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I thought Carter, my only child, would be the anchor that kept me steady. But even at the funeral, his presence felt like a cold draft seeping into an already frozen room. Carter was there, but he wasn't really present. His eyes darted around like he was keeping track of time, eager to get this whole thing over with. Next to him stood his wife Sabrina with that perfectly sympathetic smile she had perfected over the years, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. She clutched Carter's arm like a woman dutifully fulfilling her role in the tragedy, offering quick, soft condolences to people she barely knew, as if checking off boxes on a social etiquette list. I tried not to notice, but it was impossible to ignore the way they stood slightly apart from me, like I was something fragile, something inconvenient. No one said it out loud, but it was there, heavy in the air, thick in every strained word, every awkward silence. I was no longer the heart of the family. I was, excess, an extra body, a loose end they needed to figure out. 6 days after we buried, Franklin Carter showed up at my door without notice. He barely looked at me, just motioned for me to get in the car. I assumed we were heading somewhere together, perhaps to run errands or maybe grab a quiet meal to reflect. My mind, naive and hopeful as always, wanted to believe the best. I wrapped myself in Franklin's old coat, slid into his oversized slippers, because they were comforting in a way nothing else was, and followed my son without question. The drive was quiet, too quiet. Carter kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched fingers tapping rhythmically against the steering wheel. Not once did he glance my way. I asked where we were going, but he didn't answer. I told myself maybe he was just dealing with grief in his own way. Maybe silence was his coping mechanism. But when the car finally slowed down, when I noticed the houses thinning out, the sidewalks disappearing, and the coastline creeping closer, my heart began to ache in a different way. Carter pulled over by a forgotten stretch of road, the kind you see in movies when something bad is about to happen. The ocean was somewhere in the distance, its waves crashing softly like whispers in the thick fog that blanketed the road. Carter shifted the car into park and finally turned to me. His voice was calm, too calm. No anger, no bitterness, just cold detachment. "This is where you get out," he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world, Like driving your mother out to the edge of town and abandoning her was a perfectly rational Tuesday afternoon activity. I blinked, thinking I must have misheard him. Surely no one tells their mother, who just buried her husband, not even a week ago, to get out of the car like she's yesterday's trash. My lips fumbled to form words. "You're serious?" I asked, half laughing, praying it was some cruel joke. Maybe he would laugh too, apologize, tell me it was a misunderstanding, that he'd meant something else entirely. But Carter didn't flinch. He reached for my purse, placed it in my lap, and said almost mechanically, "The house and the inn are mine now. Sabrina's changing the locks today." I didn't feel the tears rise. I didn't scream or plead. I just sat there, frozen, my heart hollowing out inside me as the man I had sacrificed everything for. Birthdays, anniversaries, weekends, vacations, decades of my life, discarded me like a worn-out sweater. I looked at the gravel road beneath my slippers, felt the cold bite through my thin stockings, and for the first time in my life I realized I had been used. Not cherished, not protected, just used. Carter drove away without hesitation, his tires kicking up tiny stones as he disappeared into the mist, leaving me standing there with nothing but a purse, a coat that didn't belong to me, and the weight of 40 years of misplaced love pressing down on my chest. And I remember standing there, my back straight, my chin held high, because if there was one thing Franklin always admired about me, it was my quiet dignity. But in that moment, as I listened to the distant roar of waves and the emptiness where my son's car used to be, I finally saw my life for what it was. I had spent decades building, nurturing, sacrificing, only to end up disposable. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't plotting anything. I was simply aware. And sometimes that awareness is the first crack that lets the light back in. As I stood by that empty stretch of road, the cold, salt air biting at my cheeks, something strange happened. My mind, perhaps out of instinct for survival, started to wander backward, not just to Franklin's final days, but to all the small, quiet moments I had overlooked. Memories unspooled themselves like old film reels, each frame sharper, now clearer than they had ever been when I was living through them. I had been too trusting, too willing to excuse the little things, but now, standing alone with nothing but a worn purse and Franklin's oversized slippers, it was impossible to ignore the truth pressing down on me. This wasn't sudden. This betrayal had been growing like ivy, creeping up the walls of my life, choking the foundation without me noticing until it was too late. The first signs had come in whispers, in things I brushed off as stress or busy schedules. Carter used to call me every Sunday evening without fail. He'd check in, tell me about his week, ask if I needed anything from the market, even if we lived only 20 minutes apart. But somewhere along the way, those calls slowed down, then stopped. I told myself it was normal. He was married now, building a life of his own. That's what good parents want, I'd whispered to myself, clutching the phone long after the dial tone had gone silent. Then came the visits. Sabrina, with her always perfect hair and smile like pressed porcelain, used to come over with Carter, bringing little cakes from the bakery, sipping my tea politely. But the visits changed too. It became, "We're so busy this weekend," or "We'll stop by next month," and eventually, "Let's plan something after the holidays." Holidays that somehow always came and went without me. I remembered the Thanksgiving that should have been the warning bell when Sabrina leaned across the kitchen counter, fingers drumming lightly, and said with a soft, calculated smile, "Maybe next year we could host Thanksgiving at our place, Lillian. Wouldn't that be easier for you, Lillian?" Not Mom, not Mama, but Lillian, like I was a distant acquaintance they tolerated out of obligation. I laughed it off at the time, told myself they were trying to be helpful. But now I saw it clearly. That was the beginning of the slow erasure of who I was in their lives. The mother who raised Carter, who built a home, who stayed up at night nursing fevers and cheering at baseball games, was slowly being replaced by Lillian, the woman who needed to be managed, contained, and eventually, removed. It wasn't just emotional distance either. No, the financial control had shifted in ways that seemed harmless back then, but now made my stomach twist. When Franklin's health started declining, it felt natural to let Carter step in. He had always been good with numbers, after all. He offered to take over the bills, the paperwork, so you can focus on Dad, Mom, he'd said with a reassuring hand on my shoulder. And I, worn down by watching the love of my life fade away, had agreed without a second thought. I'd signed documents without reading the fine print, too weary to question, too trusting to suspect. I had let him handle the bank accounts, the maintenance records for the inn, even the refinancing paperwork when the roof needed replacing. "Don't worry, Mom, it's easier this way," Carter would say, and Sabrina, always nearby, always with that soft tone, would add, "It's better for you not to have to stress about these things at your age." At your age. I hadn't thought much of it then, but now I could feel the sting of those words. Slowly they had been building a case, justifying my absence from my own life, shifting me from decision-maker to dependent, from mother to burden, and like a fool I had let them. I thought back to Franklin's last year. He hated the idea of leaving our home, but his condition made it impossible for me to care for him without help. Carter convinced me that a private care facility was the best choice, promising it was temporary, just until we got through the hardest stretch. I let them sign the paperwork, arrange the transfers, believing they had Franklin's best interest at heart. I should have known. I should have realized when Sabrina started visiting less and less, when they suggested I stop coming by so often because it's hard for Dad to see you upset. I should have questioned when Carter mentioned consolidating accounts just to streamline things, Mom. I should have asked for copies of the documents they had me sign, but I didn't. I trusted them. Trusted my son. And in doing so, I had given them the rope to slowly tighten around me until they could push me out completely. Even the little things now flashed back in painful clarity. The quiet exclusion from family group chats, the accidental lack of invitations to neighborhood gatherings, the way Sabrina would always have a reason why dropping by my home was inconvenient, until eventually I stopped asking altogether. They had been pruning me out of their lives, one polite excuse at a time, while I kept making allowances, convincing myself that this was normal, that this was love shifting with time. But love doesn't erase you. Love doesn't replace your title with your first name. Love doesn't lock you out of your own home while you grieve your husband of 42 years. I realized, standing on that quiet roadside, that I had been grieving more than Franklin. I had been mourning the loss of a son I thought I knew, of a family I thought I built. The betrayal didn't happen in one cruel moment when Carter told me to get out. It had been happening for years, in whispers, in silences, in polite smiles that hid 1,000 little cuts. And the anger, the grief, the humiliation, they all began to harden into something sharper, something clearer: suspicion. I didn't know exactly what they had taken from me yet. I didn't know how far their lies stretched or what damage they had done to the life Franklin and I built with our bare hands. But I knew with certainty that I had been lied to, and that realization was like a match striking in the darkness. I would find out the truth. I would uncover every forgery, every hidden transaction, every decision made behind my back. I didn't know how yet, but I knew this. I might have been abandoned, but I was not helpless. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something unfamiliar swell in my chest. Determination. I wish I could tell you I walked away with my head held high, but the truth is, each step felt like it was made of lead. My feet dragged along the uneven gravel, the oversized slippers that once belonged to Franklin, flopping with every step, offering no support, no comfort. Just a constant, quiet reminder of what I had just lost. The wind tangled through my hair, sharp and salty, whispering things I wasn't ready to hear yet. My legs ached within the first half-mile, but I kept going because standing still felt even worse. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, but some part of me remembered that if I just kept walking south along the coastal road, I'd eventually hit a little crossroad where an old general store sat tucked between the trees. It had been years since I'd been there, but I still remembered the smell of freshly ground coffee and the wooden sign that always creaked in the wind. More importantly, I remembered Mabel Cross. Mabel had run that place since before Carter was born. She was the kind of woman who didn't fuss with pretenses, who told it like it was, and who always had a kettle simmering no matter the season. We used to chat in the early mornings when I'd stop by for Franklin's favorite blackberry jam or a loaf of sourdough. Over time, as life swallowed me whole, as I got caught in the routine of laundry loads and reservation lists and packed lunchboxes, those visits dwindled. I convinced myself I was too busy, that friendship was a luxury I couldn't afford. I realized now too late what it had really cost me. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and every part of me wanted to give up, to crumple into the dirt, and just let the cold fog swallow me whole. But somewhere under the exhaustion was a tiny, stubborn flicker that kept my legs moving. Pride, maybe. Anger. Or simply the refusal to let Carter's last memory of me be one of helplessness. By the time I saw the peeling edges of Mabel's old sign swaying above the road, my knees were trembling, my mouth parched. My whole body pulsed with a raw, empty ache. I was halfway to collapsing when I pushed open the door, and the small brass bell jingled overhead, welcoming me like an old friend. Mabel looked up from behind the counter, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, her graying hair pulled into a messy bun. Her expression shifted in an instant, from neutral to startled to deeply concerned. She didn't rush me with questions, didn't ask for explanations. She simply said, "You look like hell, Lillian," and came around the counter in her sensible shoes to catch me before I could fall, her arms wrapped around me like a safety net I didn't know I needed. I sagged into her, feeling my knees buckle under me, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of everything crashing down at once. She led me to the small kitchen in the back, sat me down in a chair so worn it fit my frame like an old glove, and placed a fleece blanket across my shoulders, without a word. I watched her move about the kitchen with practiced ease, putting a kettle on the stove, reaching into the fridge for some leftover stew, ladling it into a small pot. The quiet sounds of her movements, the click of the gas stove, the soft hum of the old refrigerator. It was the most comfort I'd felt in days, maybe years. When the tea was ready, she set it down in front of me, followed by a steaming bowl of stew, and only then did she take the seat across from me, resting her elbows on the table, and waiting. Not pushing, not probing, just waiting. It all tumbled out faster than I thought possible. The funeral, the betrayal, the ride to nowhere. Carter's cold eyes, Sabrina's rehearsed smile, the locks being changed, the casual cruelty of their dismissal, the empty road that had swallowed me whole. I thought telling it would shatter me, would break me into 1,000 fragile shards. But instead it felt like a release, like slowly loosening a tightly wound knot that had been choking me from the inside out. Mabel listened, her expression grim but steady, her hands occasionally tightening around the chipped mug in front of her. When I finished, I stared down at my empty bowl, the taste of warm broth lingering on my tongue, and felt the first flicker of something I hadn't known I was missing: dignity. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell me to forgive and forget or remind me that family was everything. She just said, "Eat a little more, you'll need your strength." And that simple statement meant more to me than any false comfort could. That night, Mabel let me stay in the spare room above the store. It wasn't fancy. Just an old iron bed, a mismatched dresser, and a small window that creaked when the wind pressed against it. But it felt like safety. I fell into bed with my limbs screaming in protest, but my heart strangely still. I didn't cry myself to sleep. I didn't replay Carter's words in my head. Instead, I whispered a quiet truth to myself in that dark little room. What I lost today wasn't just a house. It wasn't just my role as a mother. I lost the last shred of respect they pretended to have for me. And somehow recognizing that, saying it aloud, made the pain cleaner, sharper, but easier to bear. When the sun rose the next morning and the soft light filtered through the thin curtains, I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't be going back to that house. I wouldn't go stand outside those locked doors waiting for scraps of affection. I wouldn't fight for a seat at a table where I was no longer welcome. I dressed in the spare clothes Mabel offered, borrowed an old jacket that smelled faintly of lavender sachets and menthol rub, and drank my tea slowly by the window, letting the warmth seep into my bones. By the time Mabel joined me, I already had a plan. I told her I wouldn't be staying long, not because I didn't appreciate her kindness, but because I needed to find something that was mine. Somewhere that didn't have their shadows lingering on the walls, somewhere I could build something new just for me. Mabel didn't argue. She only nodded, her eyes softening, and said, "Good. You always had more steel in you than anyone ever gave you credit for." And with that, I stepped back out into the world, not sure where I was going yet, but absolutely certain of one thing. Whatever came next, it would be on my own terms. By the time I left Mabel's store, my steps felt steadier, my chest a little less hollow. I didn't have a destination, but I had something far more important: a decision. I wasn't going to let myself disappear. Not quietly, not politely, not after everything Franklin and I had built. I took a cab to a small motor lodge just off the highway, the kind of place where nobody asks questions if you pay in cash and keep your head down. That was exactly what I needed. The motel room smelled like stale lemon cleaner, and the bed springs creaked every time I shifted, but I barely noticed. For the first time in days, my mind was sharp, my purpose clear. I sat on the stiff mattress, Franklin's coat still wrapped around me, and reached for my old purse. I dug out the battered little notebook I used to keep emergency contacts in, along with a folder of documents I'd tucked away years ago out of habit more than necessity. Turns out, that habit was about to become my lifeline. I remembered Franklin's quiet warnings, the way he'd insisted we always keep something just for ourselves, just in case. A hidden savings account set aside not for vacations or luxury, but for security. I had always thought he was being cautious to a fault. Turns out Franklin had been wise in ways I hadn't fully appreciated. I powered on, my old phone fingers trembling slightly, and logged into the joint account we had opened years ago but barely touched. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the number staring back at me. 47,933s. Not millions, not a fortune, but enough. Enough to remind me that I wasn't as powerless as they wanted me to believe. I scrolled through the recent activity, my heart steadying with each entry. No unauthorized withdrawals, no signs of tampering. They hadn't found this account. Carter and Sabrina, in their rush to erase me, had overlooked Franklin's precaution, had underestimated me. A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. That was their first mistake. Next, I turned my attention to the inn, the place where I had poured my heart, my energy, and every spare dime for decades. I navigated to the county's public property records website, the one Franklin and I used to check when we bought that tiny slice of land all those years ago. It was simple enough typing in the property address, waiting as the old computer loaded the screen, flickering slightly. And there it was, clear as day. Franklin Monroe and Lillian Monroe, listed as co-owners. No recent filings, no transfer deeds, no changes to ownership. My name was still on the deed. Every legal fiber of that property still belonged to me. I leaned back in the rickety chair, staring at the screen, letting it all settle in. They lied. Sabrina with her syrupy voice and forced kindness. Carter with his calculated detachment. They tried to gaslight me into believing I had no claim, no voice, no standing. But the law told a different story. The paper trail was still intact, and it pointed right back to me. For a long moment I simply sat there breathing. The woman who had stood alone on a foggy road, discarded like useless furniture, was not just a grieving widow or a forgotten mother. She was a legal co-owner, a woman with rights, a woman with options. I knew I needed help. Someone who understood how to navigate these waters, someone who wouldn't talk down to me or dismiss me as fragile. And there was only one person who came to mind: Estelle Blake. Estelle wasn't just any journalist. She was the kind who remembered the roots of the town, who had a nose for betrayal, and who valued truth over convenience. Estelle had been a friend of Franklin's back in their high school days. She'd covered the opening of Seabreeze Haven Inn when we first launched, snapping photos of our little dream with her old Canon camera, writing warm profiles about the inn's homely charm. After Franklin's passing, She'd sent me a handwritten note, not a generic card, but real ink, real words, and genuine kindness. Thanks. I found her number scribbled in my old notebook and hesitated only a second before dialing. The line clicked and I could almost picture her on the other end, glasses perched on her nose pen, tapping against a notepad. Estelle speaking. I swallowed the lump in my throat. It's Lillian Monroe. There was a brief pause and then her tone softened. I heard about Franklin. I'm so sorry. Thank you, I said. And then, unable to keep it contained, I told her everything. The funeral, the betrayal, the eviction, the discovery of the hidden account and the deed. I told her about the lies, the forged narratives, and the quiet erasure they tried to force upon me. Estelle listened without interruption, only the occasional sound of her pen scratching against paper. When I finished, there was a quiet, thoughtful hum from her end. They thought you'd walk away quietly, she said finally. But they don't know you like I do. Lillian. They don't understand the kind of steel that runs through you. Her words, simple and sincere, bolstered something deep inside me. I don't know where to start, I admitted. Leave that to me, Estelle replied. I'll help you gather everything. Records, transactions, signatures. We'll get the paper trail clear and sharp, ready for when you need it. And just like that, I had an ally. Not just a friend, but a fierce advocate who wouldn't let me be silenced. Over the next few days, from that modest motel room with its flickering light bulb and scratchy linens, I worked. I printed out every bank statement, highlighted every line that proved my rights. I requested official property records, marked my name in bold ink, circled dates, wrote notes in the margins like a woman preparing for battle. I copied Franklin's will, his letters, even the email exchanges that documented our mutual ownership. With every piece of paper, every signature, every receipt, I felt a little taller, a little steadier. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming my name, my life, my dignity. They hadn't stolen everything from me. Not yet. They had underestimated the quiet woman who had kept the inn running through storms and lean seasons. They forgot the woman who learned every plumbing fix and electrical quirk, who built a home out of nothing but grit and heart. I was not a discarded mother. I was not a helpless widow. I was a co-owner, a partner, a woman who had been betrayed, but not defeated. And for the first time since Franklin's passing, I felt something powerful rise within me, conviction. I had never thought of myself as someone who would get tangled in legal matters. For most of my life, I was the kind of woman who avoided confrontation, who found peace in baking bread rather than signing documents. But sitting at that small motel desk surrounded by printed bank statements and county records, I realized there were moments in life when silence wasn't strength. It was surrender. And I had surrendered for far too long. With Estelle's guidance, I drafted a letter. It wasn't emotional. There were no accusations, no outbursts, no trace of the aching betrayal that still twisted in my chest. It was clinical, professional, and impossibly clear. As co-owner of Seabreeze Haven Inn as the legal name on the property deed and business accounts, I was formally notifying Carter and Sabrina that any changes to ownership, management, or business operations, without my explicit written consent, were a direct violation of my rights. Any attempt to transfer, sell, or modify the property would be met with immediate legal action. It was strange signing my own name at the bottom of that letter. My signature had always been reserved for things like permission slips, grocery checks, or thank you cards, but this time it felt different, stronger. Like each curve of my pen was reclaiming something that had been slipping from me piece by piece. I mailed copies of the letter to Carter's home, to the inn's address, to their lawyer, the same lawyer who I was sure had been whispering misleading advice into their ears. I sent an additional copy to Estelle, who promised to hold on to it as part of the growing file of evidence. I didn't expect fireworks or dramatic reactions. What I wanted was something quieter but far more powerful. A disruption they couldn't ignore. It didn't take long to get a response. Exactly 3 days later, my motel room phone rang in the late afternoon, breaking the steady rhythm of the rain against the window. I answered, and Carter's voice filtered through, sounding flat and controlled. "Mom." He began that simple word already feeling foreign after everything that had happened. "We received your letter." He didn't ask how I was, didn't offer a sliver of apology. Instead, he jumped straight into damage control. His tone was rehearsed, clipped, like someone repeating lines given by a lawyer rather than speaking from any place of honesty. "We understand you're under a lot of stress," he said, as if the past few days were some minor inconvenience rather than a deliberate act of betrayal. "And we've been under stress, too. This has been a difficult time for everyone." I stayed silent, letting him fill the air with his justifications. "We only made those decisions because we thought it would help ease your burden," he continued. "Sabrina and I have been managing things while you grieved. You've been through a lot, and maybe you weren't in the best position to make clear decisions." My fingers tightened around the phone receiver. There it was. The same narrative they had been building for months, maybe years, painting me as too fragile, too emotional, too old to be trusted with my own life. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer any reaction. I let him exhaust his excuses until his words finally slowed, stumbling into a weak attempt at conciliation. "But we'll of course honor your request. There's no need to get lawyers involved. Let's talk when you're feeling better." When I finally spoke, my voice surprised me. It was steady, cool, and precise. "There will be no discussions until I've reviewed every document you signed in my absence, every transaction, every contract, and any further decisions about the inn will go through me. You've forgotten Carter. I'm not just your mother. I'm your business partner." There was a brief silence on the line, and for the first time I imagined Carter realizing he had miscalculated. He and Sabrina thought I'd fade quietly, that I'd simply crumble under the weight of grief. They had counted on my weakness, but they hadn't accounted for my resolve. When I hung up, I didn't feel victorious. Not exactly. There was no rush of triumph, no swelling of pride. What I felt was quieter but deeper. A sense of control returning to me like a limb I thought had gone numb finally waking up. I spent the next several days combing through every file Estelle helped me collect. I reached out to Franklin's old accountant, a kind, methodical man named Roger who had always been fond of us and who quickly agreed to assist me pro bono after hearing what had transpired. Together we pieced together a timeline of the inn's finances, tracing every payment, every withdrawal, every shady signature that didn't match my own. With each document, I felt the fog around me lifting. Every forged expense Carter had slipped through the accounts, every underhanded decision Sabrina had orchestrated, became another brick in the fortress I was building around myself. They had tried to reduce me to a bystander in my own story, but I was reclaiming authorship page by page. I didn't contact Carter again. I didn't confront Sabrina. I didn't storm into the inn or make a scene. That wasn't my way. Instead, I continued quietly reinforcing my position. Securing the bank account Franklin had hidden away, re-establishing my legal authority, aligning myself with allies who actually respected me. And somewhere along the way I realized something important. For years I had told myself that love required sacrifice, that being a good mother meant endless compromise, that silence in the face of disrespect was maturity. But now, sitting alone in a modest motel room with a growing stack of legal documents and supportive messages from Estelle and Roger, I recognized how wrong I had been. Love without respect isn't love, it's manipulation. Sacrifice without acknowledgement is exploitation. And silence in the face of betrayal only breeds more betrayal. For the first time in decades, I wasn't just reacting to life. I wasn't just absorbing the hits, making excuses, or trying to keep the peace. I was standing tall, staking my claim, and reminding myself, and everyone else, that I was still here, still standing, and still worthy of respect. And in that quiet, steady moment, I understood that this was my story now. Not Carter's, not Sabrina's, mine. And I wasn't finished writing it. Not even close. There are certain moments in life when you just know you've crossed an invisible line, one of those quiet turning points where you step out of who you used to be and start becoming someone else entirely. That realization hit me as I packed my modest things from the motel, zipped up my purse with the secret bank account card tucked inside, and told myself out loud that I was not going back to Seabreeze Haven Inn. Not for answers, not for confrontation, not even for closure. I wasn't going back to any place that treated me like a relic, like a fragile old woman meant to be tucked away quietly while others decided my fate. I was going to find a new space to breathe, a place untouched by Carter's betrayal or Sabrina's smug condescension. Somewhere I could build something for myself. Not as someone's mother or someone's widow, but as Lillian Monroe, a woman who still had something left to give to herself. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I felt a pull toward the coast, a quieter town farther down the shoreline, away from the suffocating weight of my old life. I booked a bus ticket with cash, wanting nothing traceable, nothing predictable. As the miles slipped by, I sat by the window watching the landscape change. Gray skies giving way to brighter horizons, tight-knit buildings thinning out into stretches of open highway, until finally the distant scent of sea air found me again. The town I chose was nothing special by tourist standards. It didn't have the fancy resorts or the bustling boardwalks that attracted vacationers in droves. Instead, it was quieter, more understated. There were old bookstores with hand-painted signs, a pier with creaking wooden planks, and a main street lined with mismatched shops. It was the kind of place where people still waved to strangers, and where life moved at a pace you could breathe through. That's exactly what I needed. I spent 2 days walking the streets, letting the ocean breeze clear out the residue of everything I'd endured. I visited little cafes, spoke with shopkeepers who didn't know my story, didn't look at me with pity, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. And then I saw it. A narrow gravel lane leading just slightly off the main road. The sign was worn, barely readable, but my feet turned instinctively. Tucked behind an overgrown thicket of bushes stood an old cottage, its paint chipped from years of weather. Shutters slightly crooked and a porch swing that hung by a single fraying rope. Most people would have walked by, maybe shrugged it off as forgotten and unloved. But I stood there staring at it with something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. This wasn't just a rundown building. It was potential, it was resilience in wooden form, standing stubbornly against the passage of time, just like me. I could see it, beyond the peeling paint, beyond the cracked walkway. This place had bones, it had history, it had a quiet dignity. I found the property owner's number scrawled on a weathered for-lease notice tacked to the porch. I didn't hesitate. I called immediately and arranged to see the inside. The owner was an older gentleman named Clifford, who didn't ask too many questions. He told me the cottage had been sitting empty for years, once part of a family-run guest house that had been abandoned after the last recession. It wasn't much, he admitted, but he'd been looking for someone who wouldn't just occupy it, but restore it. The inside was exactly what you'd expect. Dusty floors, walls stained from water leaks, plumbing that coughed and sputtered, and a kitchen that hadn't seen life in a decade. But I didn't flinch. I walked through every room, running my fingers along the windowsills, picturing what fresh coats of paint and elbow grease could transform. It wasn't grand, but it was enough. Enough to start again. Clifford was surprised when I asked for a long-term lease paid up front in full, no hesitation. He asked if I planned to flip it to rent it out seasonally for tourists. No, I told him. I'm going to make it into a place where people come to remember who they are. I signed the lease that afternoon. Clifford handed me a set of tarnished keys, shook my hand and wished me luck with a half smile that said he wasn't sure what I saw in the place, but he was glad someone did. I stood in the center of that dusty living room, sunlight filtering through grimy windows, and made myself a quiet promise: this place would become my sanctuary. A haven for others, maybe, but most importantly, a space for me to rediscover who I was beyond sacrifice, beyond obligation. I had enough savings from Franklin's secret account to get started, not to make it fancy, but to make it functional. A few rooms for guests, a cozy common area, a kitchen that could once again fill with the smell of freshly baked bread. I didn't need extravagance. I needed simplicity, warmth, and a reminder that life could still bloom after everything had been stripped away. That night, I slept on a borrowed air mattress in one of the smaller rooms, listening to the groans of the old house settling around me, the wind whistling through cracked window panes. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was moving toward something. By morning, I had chosen a name. I stood on the front porch, the sea mist curling around my ankles, and whispered it aloud, Harbor Bloom Inn, a place by the harbor where life could bloom again, where I could bloom again. I rolled up my sleeves, tied back my hair, and got to work. This wasn't about reclaiming what Carter and Sabrina had tried to steal. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. This was for me. For the version of myself I had lost along the way, for the woman I had forgotten in the years of giving, bending, and compromising. Harbor Bloom Inn wouldn't be about grandeur or luxury. It would be about quiet moments, fresh starts, and rediscovering dignity. I didn't have a business partner, didn't have a staff. I had a toolbox, determination, and memories of Franklin's sturdy hands teaching me how to fix what was broken. And for the first time in decades, I felt free. Not because someone had rescued me, but because I had chosen to rescue myself. When I opened the doors of Harbor Bloom Inn for the first time, I didn't expect fanfare. There was no grand announcement, no glossy advertisement or ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was just me standing on the porch with my hand resting lightly on the newly polished door handle, breathing in the soft scent of the ocean, mixed with the faint traces of fresh paint and old wood. The rooms were modest, the furniture mismatched, and the wallpaper bore tiny wrinkles from years gone by. But it was mine. Every inch of it carried the fingerprints of my effort, my vision, and my stubborn refusal to be erased. I never imagined how quickly word would spread. I hadn't posted flyers or made calls, but the world has a quiet way of noticing when something honest is born. Within the first few weeks, the phone began to ring. At first, it was a couple of curious locals, people who had watched me scrub down floors and haul secondhand furniture through the front door. Then came a trickle of women from nearby towns, and soon strangers began to call. Women I had never met, their voices soft, but waited, asking if I had a room available. They didn't ask for fancy packages or room service. They asked for something far rarer, a place to breathe. The first woman who checked in was named Eileen. She was in her early 60s, a recent widow, and she arrived with nothing more than a battered suitcase and tired eyes. She told me over a quiet cup of tea that she hadn't slept through the night since her husband's funeral, that her children, though loving in their way, had quickly moved on, urging her to get back out there when she could barely make it through a grocery run without crying. I listened without interrupting, without offering forced advice. And that first evening, as Eileen sat in the tiny reading nook I had set up by the bay window, sipping peppermint tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon, I saw her shoulders relax. Just a little, but enough to remind me why I had done this. By the time Eileen left a week later, she hugged me longer than most people had in years. She said, "This place reminded me I'm allowed to be gentle with myself." I wrote her words down in my old notebook that night, adding them to the growing list of reasons I knew I had made the right choice. After Eileen came Michelle, a woman in her 40s who had just finalized a brutal divorce after decades in a controlling marriage. She brought her dog, a scruffy little terrier named Clyde, and spent most mornings on the porch with Clyde curled at her feet, staring out at the sea in silence. It took 3 days before she said more than a few words to me. On the 4th morning, she lingered in the kitchen as I baked fresh bread and asked if she could help. We worked side by side, kneading dough and sharing quiet smiles. On her last evening, she said, "You reminded me I'm not just someone's ex-wife, I'm me." And so it went. Week after week, the inn welcomed women who had been overlooked, silenced, or pushed aside. Some arrived freshly wounded, mothers abandoned by grown children, wives discarded after years of sacrifice, women who had built entire worlds for others only to be told they were no longer needed. Others came farther along in their healing, looking for a soft landing as they figured out who they wanted to be next. They came with their stories, their scars, their quiet hopes, and Harbor Bloom Inn embraced every part of them. I made it a point to keep things simple. Fresh linen sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. Hot tea always available in the kitchen. Small handwritten notes left on nightstands reminding each guest that they mattered, that their feelings weren't burdens, that they didn't have to explain or justify their hurt. There were no expectations here, no pressure to be cheerful or sociable. If they wanted to spend the day walking along the coastline, they could. If they wanted to read by the fireplace all afternoon, that was fine too. Something incredible happened along the way. Something I never anticipated. While I was building this safe space for others, I was also rebuilding myself. Each conversation, each shared cup of tea each evening, watching the tides roll in with another woman who understood pain, stitched me back together in ways I didn't realize I needed. I was no longer the woman defined solely by her sacrifices. I was no longer just Carter's mother, Franklin's wife, the innkeeper who bent over backwards to keep everyone else comfortable. I was Lillian, a woman who had been broken, yes, but who had learned that broken things could be mended, not into their old shape, but into something wiser, stronger, and more beautiful. I began to understand my worth in a way I never had before. Not in grand achievements, not in whether my son returned my calls, not in the number of guests I hosted. My worth lived in the quiet moments, in the calm of sunrise walks along the shore, in the gentle clatter of dishes after a shared meal, in the deep, wordless connections formed between women who had all in their own way been discarded by the world, but refused to stay forgotten. Harbor Bloom Inn was more than a place to stay. It became a sanctuary, a quiet rebellion against a world too quick to push women aside after they had given everything. And in giving these women space to heal, I healed too. Not perfectly, not all at once, but with every kind word, every new friendship, every soft smile, I reclaimed the version of myself I had forgotten I could be. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living for someone else. I was living for me. And it felt like breathing after years of holding my breath. I never planned for Harbor Bloom Inn to be anything more than a quiet corner of the world, a safe little haven for women like me to breathe and find their footing again. But sometimes kindness has a way of growing roots where you least expect. Word began to spread not in flashy headlines or viral social media posts, but in the oldest way possible, through whispered conversations, through handwritten letters, through the unspoken bond between women who had endured and survived. It started with a small group of guests who returned a second, then a third time. They told their friends, their sisters, women from their church groups and book clubs. I started to see familiar faces walking up the front path, their expressions softening when they stepped inside. They didn't need to ask what Harbor Bloom Inn was about. They could feel it in the way the curtains danced in the morning breeze, in the way the tea was always ready, in the quiet warmth of being truly seen. Before I knew it, there were names in my reservation book that I recognized from the old days. People who used to visit Seabreeze Haven Inn who had been loyal guests when Franklin and I first started. They wrote simple notes when they booked. "We've been looking for you," or "I'm so glad you found yourself again," or "It never felt the same without you." Each message lit a tiny flame in my chest. I had believed for a long time that I was replaceable, that people came to the inn for the building, for the coastal views, for the amenities. But now it was clear. They had come because of the care I put into every little detail, because of the way I made them feel welcome, not just served. It wasn't long before Estelle called me, her voice practically buzzing through the line. "You're not going to believe this," she said, "but Seabreeze Haven's name is mud in the local papers. Complaints, lawsuits, and the worst ratings I've seen in a decade." I didn't gloat. I didn't cheer. I just sat quietly by the kitchen window, the sun falling softly across my lap, and I listened. Estelle read out excerpts from articles, online reviews, snippets from former guests who shared their disappointment with what had become of the inn. "Run by people who don't care," one review said bluntly. "It used to feel like coming home. Now it feels like a tourist trap." Another wrote, "The magic is gone. the warmth, the genuine care. It's disappeared." Estelle chuckled. "Seems like they didn't realize you were the soul of that place all along." I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling the quiet, steady rhythm of my heart, realizing something I had long forgotten. I was never just part of the furniture. I was the heart of the home. I had been the reason people returned, the reason they felt comforted, the reason Seabreeze Haven had thrived. They had tried to erase me, but they had only hollowed out the very thing that gave that place life. My mailbox, both at the inn and online, began to fill with messages. Women wrote to me, some from far-off cities, others from small towns, not too different from this one. They told me they had followed the story that they had read about the betrayal, and that they admired how I had chosen grace instead of revenge. One letter in particular stayed with me. It came from a woman named Ruth who used to visit Seabreeze Haven every spring with her sisters. "When we heard you weren't there anymore, we stopped coming," she wrote. "It wasn't the same. But now we've found you again. And we'll be back. Not for luxury, not for convenience, but for the feeling you always gave us of belonging." I cried after reading that letter. Not out of sadness, but out of release. Out of quiet, overwhelming validation. I had spent so many years shrinking myself, convinced that my worth was conditional, tied to how useful I was to others. But here in these words, in these returning faces, I was reminded that I was enough. Without the inn, without the title of wife or mother, simply as me. The bookings for Harbor Bloom Inn filled steadily. I never overbooked. I kept it small, personal, intentional. I knew now that I didn't need more to feel fulfilled. I needed meaningful. I needed honest connections, quiet mornings, evenings of soft conversation by the fire. Sometimes I would hear whispers from the old town. Carter and Sabrina blaming each other for the inn's failure, guests asking for refunds, lawsuits threatened over fraudulent charges. I didn't reach out. I didn't respond to their pitiful attempts at control. I didn't need to. They had built their kingdom on deception, and it was crumbling beneath them while I was planting seeds in new soil and watching them bloom. Every time a guest left Harbor Bloom, I would find little notes tucked under pillows beside bedside lamps or taped to the fridge. Notes thanking me for giving them a safe space to cry, to laugh, to rediscover their own rhythm. They didn't come for entertainment. They came for peace. And somehow, by giving them peace, I had found my own. I no longer needed to measure my worth by who stayed in my life or who walked away. I no longer yearned for Carter's validation or Sabrina's approval. I no longer felt the sting of being excluded from their new life because I had built a life far richer, far more authentic. Harbor Bloom Inn was never about revenge. It wasn't about proving I could rise from the ashes. It was simply about remembering that I had never turned to ash in the first place. I had always been solid, alive, worthy. I had simply forgotten under the weight of everyone else's expectations. So I baked my bread. I tended the little rose garden I had planted by the porch. I listened to the waves crash against the distant rocks, and I welcomed every woman who arrived carrying invisible wounds. And together, quietly and gently, we healed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently. And every night before I locked the doors, I would look up at the sign that read, Harbor Bloom Inn, and smile to myself. Because no matter what they tried to take from me, I was never meant to be erased. The first letter arrived in the early spring, tucked inside a plain white envelope with no return address. I knew the handwriting the moment I saw it. I had memorized it long before Carter ever learned how to write cursive properly. There was a time when I would have cherished seeing my name in his script, when I would have tucked the letter into my apron pocket and read it by the kitchen light, letting it warm me from the inside out. But life changes and people change, and sometimes the warmth you thought would always be there turns into something cold and unfamiliar. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the little oak table by the entryway, letting it sit under the soft morning light while I brewed my tea, fed the garden, and tended to the small things that had come to fill my days with comfort. Harbor Bloom Inn was waking up for another day with guests softly moving about the kettle, hissing gently, the ocean humming in the distance. I didn't feel the urge to rush toward anything anymore, especially not apologies wrapped in late-stage guilt. When I finally opened it, I wasn't surprised by what I read. Carter's words were carefully chosen, too carefully, as if someone had coached him on how to sound remorseful without ever admitting responsibility. He talked about how hard things had been after Franklin passed, how Sabrina had been overwhelmed with the responsibilities of running the inn, how the financial pressures had been heavier than they expected. He admitted to making mistakes, but there were no specifics, no confessions of forgery, no mention of how they locked me out of my own life. There was no ownership of the choices they had made, only soft excuses dressed up as explanations. He ended the letter with, "I hope one day you'll understand we did what we thought was best. I hope you're okay, Mom." I folded the letter slowly, placing it back into the envelope. I felt no fury, no bubbling rage. I felt no overwhelming sadness either. What I felt was distance, measured healthy and deliberate. It wasn't the distance of abandonment, not anymore. It was the distance of boundaries, the kind that protects you from walking back into places that have already harmed you. For a long time I had believed I needed closure, that I needed Carter to say the words to acknowledge what he had done, to make amends before I could truly heal. But in that quiet moment, sitting on the sun-drenched porch of Harbor Bloom Inn, I realized something important. I didn't need his apology to move forward. I didn't need his permission to feel whole again. My peace was no longer tied to his recognition. My worth wasn't waiting for his acknowledgement. I had rebuilt a life where I woke up every morning with purpose, where my laughter wasn't forced, where my smile wasn't something I had to summon for the sake of appearances. I had created a home where I was valued, respected, and needed, but in a way that nourished me too. I placed Carter's letter in a small wooden box I kept by my bedside, not out of sentimentality, but out of finality, a reminder of the chapter I had closed, and the one I was now writing entirely on my own terms. In the months that followed, Harbor Bloom Inn blossomed into something I hadn't even dared to imagine. More than just a place for guests to rest, it became a quiet sanctuary where women arrived, burdened, and left lighter. They shared their stories by the fireplace, swapped recipes in the kitchen, sat in the garden, watching roses bloom against the salty breeze. They cried when they needed to, laughed when they could, and slowly, they found pieces of themselves they thought were lost. Every week I would receive little notes under the doors, messages of gratitude scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me I am more than someone's afterthought. You showed me it's okay to walk away from what breaks you." This place gave me permission to start over. And with every note, with every heartfelt thank you, I felt a quiet affirmation settle deeper into my bones. I didn't need anyone else to validate my life. Not a husband's approval, not a son's acceptance, not a family's validation. I was enough simply as I was. A woman who had survived betrayal, outgrown her old definitions, and chosen dignity over desperation. People around town began to speak about Harbor Bloom with a certain softness, with reverence. I heard locals say things like, "That place changes people," or "You leave Harbor Bloom knowing exactly who you are." It became more than an inn. It became a quiet landmark for second chances, for rediscovery, for peace. And I, Lillian Monroe, stood at the center of it, not as someone who had been defeated, but as someone who had risen calmly and fully, not because someone apologized, not because the past had been corrected, but because I had learned to separate myself from the harm, to build beauty from ruin, to find light where others tried to cast shadow. That was my legacy, not the inn Carter tried to control, not the family role they tried to confine me to, but the living proof that healing is ours to claim even without an apology. That life can bloom again quietly, beautifully, and without permission from anyone but ourselves. The roses had bloomed again. Every morning I took my slow walk through the little garden behind Harbor Bloom Inn, letting the tips of my fingers brush across the petals. The wind was soft that morning, carrying the scent of salt water and fresh blossoms. I had planted those rose bushes myself the previous spring. One red, one peach, one pale yellow. The same colors Franklin had once loved. I smiled as I watched them sway gently under the morning sun. They were stronger now, fuller, more alive than they had been when I first planted them. I understood the feeling. There was something healing about these quiet rituals. The way my boots crunched softly against the gravel, the way the morning light slipped between the wooden fence posts, the way I paused near the porch steps to breathe in the sea air, letting it fill my chest, reminding me I was still here, still standing, still becoming. Guests came and went through Harbor Bloom, each carrying their own quiet ache, each hoping to find some forgotten piece of themselves in the comfort of these worn floorboards, the scent of lavender and fresh linens, the warmth of a quiet kitchen in the early hours. And they did, each in their own way. But what mattered most to me was realizing that I had done the same. I had built this space with my bare hands, painted the walls, planted the garden, scrubbed the old floors until they shined. But more than that, I had built it inside myself too. I had taken back every part of me that had been stolen, erased, or ignored. I had filled the hollow spaces with peace, with quiet confidence, with a calm that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. Carter hadn't written again. Sabrina hadn't called. The world I once lived for had gone quiet, and I had stopped listening for it. I had stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, for acknowledgments that no longer mattered. The greatest gift I had ever given myself wasn't forgiveness, it was freedom. The women who stayed at Harbor Bloom often asked me gently if I ever missed my old life. I told them the truth. I missed the parts of myself I gave away back then. The quiet parts, the joyful parts, the parts that believed I deserved softness. But that life itself, no. I didn't miss the noise of being taken for granted. I didn't miss being someone people only remembered when they needed something. I didn't miss the heaviness of trying to prove my worth over and over again. Now I lived lighter, not because life had become easier, but because I had let go of everything that was never mine to carry. I had learned that you don't have to be anyone's priority to be whole. You don't have to be useful to be valuable. You don't have to be needed to matter. The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. Another guest had arrived, a woman in her 50s carrying a canvas bag and eyes that looked tired but hopeful. I smiled as she stepped onto the porch, feeling that quiet familiarity settle in my chest, the quiet knowing that she too would leave here standing a little taller. I walked toward her, welcoming her not just into the inn, but into the little world I had reclaimed for myself. A world where healing didn't have to be loud, where strength didn't have to look like anger, where survival could bloom quietly, beautifully, patiently. Later that evening, I sat by the porch with a warm cup of tea, listening to the waves in the distance. I thought about how life had surprised me, how what I thought was my ending had been the beginning of something far more meaningful, how being discarded had made space for me to rebuild myself, brick by brick, breath by breath. I whispered it softly to myself, letting it hang in the quiet air like a promise. You don't need their permission to live fully. You don't need their recognition to feel whole. You don't need their approval to be happy. All you ever needed was your own decision to begin again, on your own terms. And in that moment, with the ocean stretching wide in front of me, the roses blooming strong behind me, and the warm lights of Harbor Bloom casting their soft glow across the porch, I knew the truth in my bones. This wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. After dedicating her whole life to family, Lillian Monroe was betrayed by the very people she trusted most. Left stranded by her son just 6 days after her husband's funeral, she was discarded like a burden, or so they thought. But in this gripping journey of resilience, she quietly took back everything, without yelling, without revenge, but with silent, unstoppable strength. This is not one of those loud revenge stories. This is something deeper, where betrayal is answered with quiet dignity and family drama unravels not in courtrooms, but through rediscovery of self-worth. If you've ever been erased by the people you loved, this story will show you how to reclaim your power. Stay tuned as Lillian finds freedom after betrayal, transforms heartbreak into healing, and builds a life so powerful it becomes the best revenge of all. These revenge stories remind us sometimes family drama ends not with screaming matches, but with you winning silently. Watch until the end to see how one forgotten woman rewrites her story after betrayal, proving some revenge stories are written with grace, not anger.